Okay, good afternoon or good morning, everyone, depending on what time zone you're in. I'm Nisha Patel. I'm the Executive Director of the U.S. Partnership on Mobility from Poverty, based here at the Urban Institute in D.C. And we're here today to talk about restoring the American dream. And I know many people are probably multitasking. If you're on the East Coast, you might be eating your lunch. If you're in the Midwest, you might be checking your email, and if you're on the West Coast, maybe you're just getting up and getting started. So I'm going to try to make this as lively and engaging as possible, so hopefully you'll pay attention and get a lot out of this. So to kick off, I am excited to share that we have well over 450 friends and colleagues, old and new, who are registered for this webinar, joining us from all across the United States. And I actually want to do some special shout outs to some of the people who I know are joining us on this webinar. First, I want to make sure and thank many people who are on the call who hosted the partnership for site visits and learning sessions over the past 2 years. We couldn't have done our work without all of you. And second, many of you who I know are on the call participated in a number of design labs that we held last year to help develop some of the ideas that I'm going to be talking about. So a huge thanks to all of you as well. And then third, I want to personally do a special shout out to colleagues who are dialed in from the Office of Family Assistance at the Administration for Children and Families at HHS, because you have the record for the most participants registered for this webinar. And I might be a little biased because these are folks that are part of my wonderful former team, and they are some of the hardest working people in government. So thank you for taking time out of your day to join us. We're going to try to leave plenty of time at the end for questions and answers. So please feel free to send questions using the chat function. And you can also, if you would like, after the webinar, tweet me your reactions, and you can see my Twitter handle there on the screen. It's just at @HeyNisha. So a couple of housekeeping things before we dive in. The webinar is being recorded, so if you have colleagues that couldn't join, it will be posted along with the slides after the webcast. And right now, all of the participants who are dialed into the call are muted. So if you have questions or comments, please type them using the chat function into the questions box that you should see on the right of your screen. And please be sure to include your name and organization. We'll try to get to as many live questions as we can, and we'll try to consolidate questions because some of you may have the same questions. And if you have questions later, you can send them to the email address that you see on your screen, which is just events@urban.org. And then finally, if you would like to tweet while you're listening, you can use the hashtag #mobilityfrompoverty, which you also see on your screen. Okay, so let's dive in. And I want to start by talking about the topic that the partnership has been focused on the last couple of years, which really is the American dream. And if you ask most people what the American dream is, they'll often say one of two things. They'll often say, that the American dream is, if you work hard, you should be able to get ahead. A second thing that a lot of people talk about with the American dream is that, hopefully you have a chance to do well, but even if you struggle, the hope is that your children or the next generation will have a chance to do better. So that's the dream, but then what's the reality? So unfortunately, as I think we all know too well, the dream is not within reach for everyone. And the first issue is that today, children are actually less likely to do better than their parents. So we now have lower rates of absolute economic mobility than we once did. Another big factor is that it turns out, unfortunately, hard work isn't enough. We have fewer jobs today that provide good wages and benefits, particularly for lower skilled workers. And then the third major factor is place. Place matters a lot, or as one of our partnership members, Tony Eiton with the California Endowment, has said, zip code matters more than genetic code when it comes to mobility. And of course, layered on top of this are issues of race, gender, and immigration status, which also matter greatly in terms of people's access to opportunities. And then finally, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, I'll talk about all of these a bit more in depth, stigma and isolation are a huge barrier to progress. So first, the issue of children being less likely to do better than their parents. So the graph that you see on your screen is analysis from Raj Chetty, who's one of our partnership members and an economist at Stanford University. And what you can see on this line graph, starting on the left, is we now have lower rates of absolute economic mobility. And if you remember we're going to cover a lot of information. So if you remember only one statistic from this webinar, I would ask you to make it this one, because I think it just so clearly illustrates the stagnant mobility we have right now. So what you see on the left side of the chart is that for children born in 1940, 90% of those children had higher income than their parents when they reached adulthood around age 30. So that was, what many people think of as the American dream. But if you fast forward and move to the right across the chart to 1980, what you see is that only about 50% of children born in 1980 had higher income than their parents. So this is a huge drop, and I think what it illustrates, is the big takeaway is that if people across the country feel like it's harder to get ahead than it once was, that's because it is. So the next big factor around hard work, and hard work not being enough in today's economy. So as I mentioned before, we now have fewer jobs that provide good wages and benefits, particularly for lower skilled workers. And there are a huge number of different data points that I could use to illustrate this. And I've just highlighted one here because I think it's particularly powerful. And this is analysis that comes from the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. And what they find is that in no state, metropolitan area, or county can a person working full-time at the minimum wage afford to rent a modest two-bedroom apartment. And they calculate that as 30% or less of the person's income. And this is true across the country, despite the fact that many states, in fact, the majority of states, DC and some local jurisdictions have minimum wages that are higher than the federal minimum wage. And then the next factor, as I mentioned, disparities around race, around gender, as well as immigration status persist in terms of people's access to opportunity. And so what you can see on the next chart which is about the share of different populations that are engaged in low-wage work. You can see that women are far more likely to be working for low wages than are men, and we define low wages as less than $12.50 per hour. So if you look at the first and second sets of bars, you can see that clearly. And then there are far greater shares of Black and Hispanic people who are working in low-paying jobs than there are white people. And you can see that clearly if you compare the green and blue bars to the yellow bars that you see on your screen. And then when we layer on other factors, when we look at these disparities, they're amplified when we look at the intersection of race, ethnicity, and gender. And so what you can see in the chart is that while only 20% of white men are working in low-wage jobs, almost 40% of Black women are working in low-wage jobs, and 46% of Hispanic women are working in low-wage jobs. And then when we layer on top of that immigration status, the disparity becomes even starker. So what you can see at the right side of the chart, the long blue bar, is that more than 60% of Hispanic women who are non-citizens, which importantly includes legal permanent residents, 60% of these workers are working in low-wage jobs. The next factor is around place. And again, the map that you see on your screen is analysis from Raj Chetty and his colleagues at the Equality of Opportunity Project. And this is a map that's showing chances of children who were born in the bottom 20% of income, so the bottom quintile, and their chances of moving to the top 20% at the adults, right? So this would be sort of ultimate economic mobility. And so the thing to keep in mind with this chart is that where you see areas of green, this indicates more upward mobility. So the darker the green, the greater your chances of upward mobility. And then red indicates less upward mobility. So the darker the red, the less your chance of upward mobility if you grow up in one of these areas. And so, for example, if you look at California, if you look at parts of the West and the Midwest, you can see patches of green and dark green. So these areas look much better than some other parts of the country. And in particular, you can see pulled out there San Jose, the Silicon Valley area, which has historically had one of the highest rates of upward mobility. And, I think it's important to think about sort of the time in which these data were analyzed and then sort of current day. And there's a question, I think, now about whether it's still the case that all of these areas still provide the same level of opportunity and upward mobility. And thinking about the San Jose Silicon Valley area, for those of you who might be in that community, you're well aware that there's a pretty significant affordable housing crisis. So I think that calls into question how some of these communities have changed over time. And you might contrast some of these green areas with, the southeastern United States. And you can see very clearly that there's a lot of dark red there. And particularly if you look at the Mississippi Delta region, you can see that most of those areas are red. So remember this map, because it's something that I'm going to come back to later in the presentation, this idea of how much place matters. And I would say to summarize, the key takeaway here is that right now, zip code can determine your destiny. And so the next factor is that poverty in the United States is isolating and stigmatizing. And so if you look at this next chart, it sort of helps depict something that we have talked about in the partnership, and many others have as well, as othering. So Americans systematically other people in poverty. And what we mean by this is that they reinforce their own bonds within groups with people that they see as like themselves by devaluing others, devaluing people outside the group and assigning them outsider status. And so this particular chart shows a study of college students using a 5-point scale. And the researchers found large differences in beliefs about people in poverty and people in the middle class across a wide range of attributes. And so people in poverty are represented by the yellow bars and middle class people by the blue bars. And what you can see is that people in poverty were far more likely to be seen as dirty, as unpleasant, and as violent, and far less likely to be seen as responsible, family-oriented, and hardworking. So this is really important and has really shaped the partnership's thinking about how much beliefs and attitudes and the narratives that we hold about poverty matter in terms of the decisions about where we choose to focus our solutions and focus investments. So it's against this backdrop, all of these factors that I've just talked about, that the partnership set about our task. And it was a task given to the partnership by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which has funded our work. And that task very simply was, it's complicated, but the question was simple, was to answer the question, what would it take to dramatically increase mobility from poverty? Or what would it take to turn things around and restore the American dream? And in terms of the audience for the ideas that we've developed in response to this question, we've really been in the idea generation business over the last couple of years. We had a particular emphasis on those who might have the capacity to invest in these ideas. And so in particular, we thought a lot about what the role of philanthropy could be and what the role of the public sector, so that's government at all levels, federal, state, and local, as potential investors for the ideas. But at the same time, we recognize that it's the implementers who matter, right? It's the practitioners, the direct service organizations, advocates, and researchers who will play a key role in testing and implementing and in moving these ideas forward. So we're very interested in reactions from all of these key stakeholders and from all of you who are joining us on the webinar today. So a little bit of background about the people who've been involved in the partnership. You can see the list on your screen, and you'll probably see some names that many of you recognize and some names that will be new to you. And I think one of the things that was really interesting about the partnership is, and it was comprised of people from incredibly diverse backgrounds, many of whom had never met before. The partnership is chaired by David Elwood at the Kennedy School, and his vision and leadership has really helped to guide our work. And the partnership is comprised of 24 members who, as I said, come from an incredibly diverse fields and perspectives. The majority, which I think is different from perhaps many commissions that have come before, the majority of our group are people of color. And they come from different sectors and very different political points of view in some cases. And we've got a mix of economists, psychologists, sociologists, people running programs on the ground, policy experts, and 5 MacArthur geniuses or MacArthur fellows. And importantly, for all of this, for everything that I'm about to share with you today, it's important to know that we're not a consensus group. And I think that's pretty different from some efforts that have come before. And so it made our work both, I think, really interesting and challenging at the same time. So it's important for me to state up front, I'm going to hit on a lot of different ideas that we've developed, but because we're not a consensus group, not every partner supports every individual idea proposal that I'll talk about and which we'll be releasing between now and April. And so a bit about sort of, I'm going to get to the what, but a little bit about the how, because I think that really was important in shaping our work and the ideas we developed. We began our work about 2 years ago, and we really began by dreaming big, by considering the big forces that shape mobility in the United States. And actually what you see on your screen are some graphic recordings that were created real time during the partnership's early deliberations. And so as you can see, some of the drawings on the screen, we looked at place, as I've talked about already. We looked at what we know from behavioral psychology, from economics, and from brain science. We also, importantly, looked at race. We looked at gender. We looked at issues of inclusion and dignity. So, for example, we held an intensive learning session on race and structural racism at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which is a really powerful experience for our group. And we had the good fortune to be led in this work by Jennifer Eberhardt, who's a partnership member and a social psychologist at Stanford. We also had a focused learning session, which on a sector which I think often can get left out of these conversations, which is the role of faith and the faith community. And we're so thankful to Reverend Luis Cortez and his team at Esperanza in Philadelphia for leading us in that effort. And then, finally, we looked at the changing labor market. There are so many different forces that are shifting in the labor market, and I'll talk about a few of them. And I think it's also important to note that we looked at the intersection of all of these different themes that are shaping mobility. And so to ground our exploration from the very beginning, we wanted to make sure that we were considering the evidence base behind the ideas that we were developing. And so our research team at the Urban Institute developed a working paper that outlined 13 different building blocks of mobility and examples of promising programs. And this was back in July of 2016. And this working paper is actually also publicly available on our website if you're interested in seeing that. But just to give you sort of the high level, as you can see on your screen, we looked at a range of issues. So we looked at everything from housing to early learning, to safety and justice, to employment and training, health and mental health. So this was just a way of sort of dividing up the world. And as important as research, a key aspect of the partnership's work has been learning from practice and learning from communities. And so we really baked into our DNA a mix of learning from research, from practice, and from people experiencing poverty, ensuring that their perspectives, which are so often left out, were brought to the table in our deliberations. And so site visits have been a really important part of our work. And so we held each of our gatherings, not at a conference room at a university or at a conference room in DC. We held them in very different places and in communities around the country. We really wanted to ground our deliberations in community level perspectives. And we were so fortunate to visit and learn from diverse urban, suburban, rural, and tribal communities all across the country. I think all told, we did more than 30 site visits. And so we went from Brooklyn to Detroit, which is actually the photograph that you see on your screen is at a session that we had in Detroit, and I want to just give a big shout out to the Family Independence Initiative and Brilliant Detroit, who were so generous with their time and really helped shape our thinking and the language that we've taken to using around empowerment. Then we also spent time in the rural Mississippi Delta, which, as you saw from the map earlier, has historically one of the lowest rates of economic mobility. So recall that area that was mostly in red on the map. And here I particularly want to recognize Bill Bynum, one of our partnership members, and his colleagues at Hope Enterprise Corporation for organizing what was an absolutely amazing learning session for the partnership, in a part of the country that is too often out of sight and out of mind for so many Americans. And I hope that our work and in partnership with Bill and his colleagues can help elevate both the need and the opportunity in the Delta and in rural areas all across the country. And we also spent time in Silicon Valley. So think about the map that I showed before, right? This is a part of the country that had one of the highest rates of economic mobility. So we really tried to learn from very different contexts, from the highs and the lows. And we began each of our gatherings with kind of an immersive experience in the community. So, for example, the picture that you now see on your screen is at a community center in the Mayfair neighborhood in East San Jose. And really want to recognize here the families and the staff at Somos Mayfair who very much helped influence our thinking about how we're defining mobility. So Mayfair is the neighborhood where Cesar Chavez actually began his organizing. So there's a really important history there. And in this conversation, we were talking primarily with Mexican immigrant individuals and family members. And we were having a conversation here in simultaneous Spanish and English interpretation. And the community residents shared with us that, and this speaks to the affordable housing crisis I spoke about before. They shared with us that renting a couch to sleep on in this neighborhood can cost $600 a month just for a couch. And renting a garage, not a home, but a garage for a family to live in can cost $1,000 a month. And these are families who are living within 30 minutes of just the biggest tech companies in the world, right? The ones that are in the news every day. Yet one of the women that we spoke with asked us in Spanish, what is this word? What is this Silicon Valley that you keep talking about? And I think that really powerfully highlights and illustrates both the economic and cultural divides in that region. And while they're pretty extreme in that region of the country, I think in some ways they parallel what we're seeing in many other communities around the country. Okay. So where have we landed? I've sort of told you about the journey we've been on, how we got to where we are. But what is it we've come up with? So as I mentioned at the beginning, the partnership was given the challenge to think really creatively and answer the question, what would it take to dramatically increase mobility from poverty? And we're certainly not the first group to tackle poverty in the U.S., but unlike commissions that have come before, we didn't limit ourselves to a narrow traditional definition of poverty. And I give our chair, David Elwood, again, a lot of credit for this. It was very much his vision to push the group to think more broadly. And what we pretty quickly recognized is that if we focus narrowly on income, all we would have to do is develop a set of ideas to help people move $1 above the poverty level, right? And it might appear that our work was done, but when you step back and think about it, the reality is that these individuals and families would likely continue to struggle and wouldn't necessarily be on a pathway to upward mobility. And a big insight at our very first gathering, so we were discussing how we might measure success. John Powell, one of our partnership members who's based at UC Berkeley, said something pretty profound that immediately resonated with our group. He said, here's the thing about poverty. It's not just about a lack of money. It's also about a lack of power, right? So economic success, the things we typically measure in the field of folks that work on poverty and mobility, things like income and assets and wage gains, those are super important. In fact, they're fundamental, but they're not enough. And so equally important is this notion of power and autonomy, which really speaks to having a sense of agency over your life, or having a say in the trajectory of what happens in your community. And then equally important is the third principle, which is this notion of being valued within the community. And what was particularly interesting about this element is that it was a perspective that emerged from both partnership members on the right and on the left. So Arthur Brooks, one of our partnership members, comes from a conservative perspective, and he heads up the American Enterprise Institute. He often talks about this concept as dignity, as having dignity and meaning. And John Powell, who I already mentioned, comes from a much more progressive perspective, and he talks about this concept as belonging. And you can think about belonging as in contrast to that concept of othering that I spoke about before. And so these three principles that make up our definition of mobility have been informed by conversations all across the country And what we've found is that they've strongly resonated with really diverse audiences. So this is one of our biggest insights. We think we're onto something here. And ideally, each of the ideas and the strategies that I'm going to talk about that we'll be putting forward over the next several weeks should embody all three of these principles. And then, of course, the next question that people often ask is, okay, this sounds really great, but how would you measure them, right? And so we think it's really important to measure outcomes, not just around economic success, but outcomes around power and autonomy and being valued in community. And we actually have a paper and a toolkit in development around that. So stay tuned for that later this year. Okay, so now on to the actual strategies themselves. So what are the strategies? And actually, before I go into that, I should say my goal today is just to really, given the limited time we have, just to scratch the surface and hopefully whet your appetite for some of the future idea papers that'll be forthcoming and the series of webinars we have planned for the next several weeks, where there'll be a chance to go in depth into some of these ideas and actually have a chance for you to interact with some of the people who had the vision behind the ideas and the authors of the papers. But the first overall strategy I want to talk about is changing the narrative. Right? And what do we mean by narratives? So narratives are the stories that we tell ourselves to make sense of the world. They are overarching. They are the context for everything. So that's why we often talk about that first. Narrative really surrounds everything else. And so as we talked about earlier, poverty in the US can be highly stigmatizing. And so there's a strong feeling among many members of the partnership that we need to shift the narrative. And one idea is that we might shift toward a new narrative that recognizes that as a nation, we haven't historically been in it together. And we need to shift to the idea and recognize we really are all in this together. And if we can do that, members of the partnership believe it could open up possibilities to move policy and program ideas at greater scale, right? And another thing I should note is there is no shortage of good ideas. And in fact, the ideas that I'm going to talk about today, the ideas that the partnership is putting forward, are not intended to be an exhaustive list. There are many, many other worthy ideas out there. And in particular, I would note there's an immense amount of work happening in the health and education spaces that I want to recognize. But what you'll see is that the members of the partnership actually chose to lift up some different ideas going beyond health and education that they found particularly compelling and felt deserved, perhaps weren't getting enough attention and could use more attention. So back to narrative specifically, this is a new area for many people. We don't purport to have all the answers here. There's not as well developed a sector as there is for some of the other ideas. So there is much more long-term work that needs to be done. But some of the specific tactics we're looking at are first, in contrast to the stigma that exists, humanizing people in poverty. So for example, one concrete idea that we've talked about is creating compelling television that would highlight the realities of people's lives in mainstream media and pop culture. Another tactic we've talked about is exposing some of the structural forces I've talked about today, but to do it in a way that shows how individuals are impacted, to show who wins and who loses when only some people have access to opportunities. And then third, we've talked about the importance of identifying non-traditional allies, right? So people, organizations, groups that might have very differing worldviews, but share a common goal to dispel some of the myths about poverty. And so if you're interested in this topic, stay tuned. We'll actually have an idea paper coming out that provides more details on this by early April. So please look for that. Okay, so then the second strategy is around creating access to good jobs. Obviously, this is a very well-developed sector. There are probably many people on the call who are doing work in this area. And our aspiration here is that everyone who is willing to work ought to have a chance to get a good job. And there are a whole bunch of different trends that we looked at with this work. So we looked at there's some things in the labor market that are declining. So what we are seeing is a decline in traditional employment relationships that provide good wages, benefits, and work-based protections. We've seen a decline in unionization, particularly in the private sector. And then we are seeing a decreased likelihood that any of us will work for one single long-term employer. At the same time, there are a set of other things where we're seeing increases. So we're seeing a growth in alternative work arrangements. So these are things like contract work, temp work, and on-call arrangements. Second, we're seeing an increase in people simultaneously working for multiple employers, including gig economy jobs, like people who are driving for Lyft or for Uber. Although it's important to note those are while they're a growing share, they're a much smaller share of the labor market than contract, temp, and on-call work. And then third, what we're seeing is what some economists have talked about as a fissuring of the workforce across employers by wages and education. So we're seeing higher returns, greater profits to businesses that have employees with highly educated workers, while simultaneously what we see is persistent low wages and irregular schedules in sectors that employ lower skilled workers. And then third, we're just seeing some other things that are just shifting altogether. So we've seen a rapid shift in the ways people are getting jobs, whether that's through online job search and recruitment tools, or through displacement of jobs by automation and artificial intelligence. So whether that is cashiers that are being replaced by self-checkouts, bank tellers being replaced by ATMs, truck drivers, many predict soon to be replaced by autonomous vehicles, or the food delivery robots that are in my neighborhood. And if you live in DC, you've probably seen them around your neighborhood as well. So here's the thing, some people have asked the question, are robots really going to take all our jobs? What I would say to that is most of the economists in our group believe there'll be no shortage of jobs. They may just not be good, well-paying jobs that offer career pathways. And in particular, jobs that require empathy, jobs like care work, are unlikely to be replaced by robots anytime soon. And as Larry Katz, one of our partnership members and a Harvard economist, has said, robots don't yet do empathy. Right? So some of the solutions that we're looking at in this space that we sometimes think of as this future of work space are a new approach to worker classification that would extend protections to all workers. We're looking at ways to experiment with providing portable benefits, alternative ways to build capacity for worker voice, looking at creating subsidized jobs and job guarantees, particularly in communities where there may be a shortage of good jobs or for populations that might have difficulty entering the labor market. And importantly, looking as well at expanding the earned income tax credit. And we're also looking at care work as a case study. So when I say care work, what I'm talking about there is people who are providing in-home care to our elders, to our young children, to family members with disabilities. And this is actually one of the fastest growing sectors in our economy, yet it's one of the lowest paid. And still yet these are some of the most vital jobs in our society, right? These are jobs that we all need and that greatly benefit society. And so we're looking at this sector as a potential case study on how we can transform lower wage jobs without career pathways into good ones that offer routes to upward mobility. And actually, we just posted on our website today, we just released a paper that goes in depth on these issues on the future of work. So I encourage you to check that out if you're interested in learning more. And then we also have a complementary strategy that's looking at, upskilling and better connecting training to employer demand, and specifically focusing on community colleges, not because we think they're the only institution, but they're the institution where the largest share of lower income people are accessing skills training beyond high school. And that paper is also on our website, so I encourage you to check that out for more information. Okay, and then our third strategy is what we talk about as ensuring zip code is not destiny, right? What would it look like if we could change the composition of that map that you saw earlier? And what we saw on that map is that where we are grown and where we grow up plays a significant role in our chances of upward mobility today. And so we've got 4 major proposals in this area, and we'll also be releasing individual idea papers on each of these over the next few weeks, so please be on the lookout for those again. But just to touch quickly on these 4 strategies, the first one is around what we frame as opportunity neighborhoods. And our aspiration here is that everyone deserves the opportunity to thrive within a safe and caring community. And we're putting forward actually a multi-pronged approach here. We actually think this is a both-and strategy. We've got to do all of these things. So first, we have to transform communities and the institutions that serve them. So that really involves revitalizing communities. We have to remove the barriers often put in place by public policy historically that segregate neighborhoods, that limit where people can live and learn. And we need to encourage more economically diverse neighborhoods. And then second, While we want to focus on revitalizing neighborhoods, we also have a proposal that's looking at housing vouchers because we know about the importance of safe and stable and caring environments for young children's development in particular. And so we're proposing expanding rental vouchers, particularly for families with children under 6, to give those families that want the choice the opportunity to move to different neighborhoods that might offer better housing, better schools, and better job opportunities. And then third, we're looking at the important issue of access to financial services. So some of the promising ideas here include establishing universal access to bank accounts and extending financial services to banking deserts by increasing investment in community development financial institutions. And then fourth and finally, and this is a really important issue, we looked at the intersection of poverty and criminal justice, safety and justice. And I think this is a pretty interesting and cutting-edge proposal. We've got, some proposals we're putting forward that are not necessarily new ideas, but we thought they deserve more attention. This one is a new idea that actually hasn't been tried before. And we were looking at how violence and the criminal justice footprint in many low-income communities could be reduced if residents of those communities that have high poverty and high crime and high violence had the power and autonomy to work together with police departments, with other key stakeholders to identify what they need and want from the justice system to feel safe. So for example, what if residents had more of a say in how resources were allocated? What if dollars that are currently spent on yanking mostly young men of color out of communities through mass incarceration were spent in a more upstream way? What if residents wanted to see those resources spent on positive youth development? So what could that model look like, and how could it be moved to action? And then our fourth strategy is around providing support that empowers. And we have many programs and policies today that have the goal of moving people out of poverty, but they often provide that support without offering dignity and respect, without fostering engagement in community, right? Those other two really important principles of mobility that I talked about. And so our aspiration is that programs and policies should put people and families at the center, support their goals and capacity, and work across domains. And we have a large number of proposals in this area, and again, we'll have detailed papers on each of these, as well as some webinars with the authors on many of these proposals in the next few weeks. So I'll just hit the highlights here. We're proposing really 5 big ideas. The first is around expanding the child tax credit. Another idea, which is around scaling up home visiting programs, which currently only reach about 4% of low-income families who could benefit. Third, we're looking at testing what we describe as coach navigator models. And these are models that we think could really revolutionize human services by increasing use of approaches that incorporate brain and behavioral science. And then we have 2 proposals that I think of as sort of 2 halves of a whole that are focused really on family structure and looking at the growth in the number of less stable and more complex families. So on the front end, looking more upstream, we're looking at the prevention of the formation of so-called fragile families. So we're looking at doing that by combining positive youth development with access to better birth control for those who want that choice. And then second, we're also recognizing, look, the reality is that we today have many more complex families. These families exist today, and a key institution that they interact with is the child support system. And so we're proposing to transform the child support system to be more of a family building institution. So again, stay tuned for a paper and a webinar on both of these topics. Okay, and then fifth and finally is a strategy that we are putting forward around transforming data use. And I mentioned, before that narrative is overarching. It surrounds everything, and data is undergirding. Like, it really undergirds all of our idea proposals. So we have billions of public and private resources in the U.S. that are deployed to address poverty annually, but the results of those investments are not always clear. So we have programs, probably many of you on the phone work in some of these programs. You collect vast amounts of data that could be used to help people on pathways to opportunity, as well as to hold programs accountable. But those data are rarely linked and shared in ways that are accessible and usable, and particularly to low-income people themselves. And so our aspiration here is to transform data systems to increase accountability and transparency. And I know that not everyone listening today is a data geek, myself included, and so I wanted to actually just kind of drive home this point by sharing a quote from one of our partnership site visits that really just drives home the importance of transforming data use. And this was from a site visit that the partnership did to Baltimore. And folks from our partnership had a chance to speak with Dr. Leanna Wen, who's the Commissioner of Health in Baltimore. And I'll just read you her quote. She said, "As part of child fatality review, department heads in Baltimore city government get together once a month. We review every child death that happened in the city since the previous meeting. We ask what more might have been done to prevent that tragedy. In many cases, each of us has a file on the child or a family at least an inch thick. It's tragic to compare notes after the child has died. What more could we have done when the child was alive?" So I think that just profoundly exemplifies why we need to better connect data systems. And so some of the ideas that we're looking at are investing particularly in promising solutions at the state and local level, because that's really where the rubber hits the road. Second, supporting data centers that can match data across systems and also, importantly, protect privacy. And then third, looking at creating some data infrastructure standards that could be used in localities and states around the country. So please be on the lookout for our forthcoming paper on this topic. And so in summary, pulling all these 5 pieces together, dramatically increasing mobility from poverty will require investment in 5 mutually reinforcing strategies: in narrative, jobs, place, people, and data. And any one of these things on its own is important to do. It could make a certain level of progress. But if we want to dramatically increase mobility from poverty, it will require all of these things, and it will require cross-sector collaboration. So there's no one person or organization on this call, one government agency, no one philanthropy, no one institution can do it alone. But working together, we believe we can dramatically increase mobility from poverty and restore the American dream. So now you've heard what the partnership came up with. I've scratched the surface, at least, of some of the ideas that we have in development and that you'll be hearing more about in the next few weeks. But I want to now turn to questions and reactions. And a bunch of you have been furiously typing away as I've been talking. And if you haven't yet, you'll see on your screen again the directions. Feel free to type your questions in the chat function. We've got a team of folks here who are rapidly trying to read and consolidate some of your questions. And so let me go to a few of them that I have here in front of me. Okay, so the partnership is sharing its ideas. What happens next? So after today, so I mentioned, many of you have had a chance to see our sort of framework paper, Restoring the American Dream. We will be releasing individual idea papers over the next couple of months. And so just today, posted on our website, you will find the paper on the future of work, the paper on community colleges. You'll also be, if you're signed up for our newsletter, which I encourage you to do, you'll get announcements about upcoming webinars. And then our work will culminate in an event here in DC on May 3rd, and welcome folks both locally and from across the country who would like to attend, where we will highlight the work of the partnership. We will highlight community voices, which have been so important in our work, and we hope to be able to share more about what comes next. The partnership's work will be complete. We have the task of developing ideas. What will come next is, and what will be really important, is commitments from organizations to actually invest in and implement the ideas. So that's what the next phase of the work will look like. Okay, another question. Let's see. I could see groups at the state, local, or regional level working together to implement some of these ideas. Is that happening already? Absolutely. And so, we have, as I described before, we have had conversations with all kinds of different organizations, nonprofits, government philanthropies, community foundations that have taken on sort of this concept, this notion of economic mobility as an organizing principle. So we're seeing these kinds of efforts all around the country, and we hope to, when you have a chance to look at some of the papers we're putting out, we've tried to highlight some of those examples and hope to do more of that in our upcoming webinars and events. You mentioned the papers the partnership is publishing. Will these, and yes, some of the papers will be like, will these papers be available in a shorter format? Yes, the answer is yes. That's a great question. Whoever, I'm not sure who asked that, but whoever asked that, because we know that you're all busy people, and so we want to make the information available in ways that are accessible, and that people have time to digest. And so we're trying to do that. So for each of the longer papers, there will be a 2-page version, which we hope if the 2-pager excites you, you'll want to read more and read the longer paper. We've got some videos that are up on our website that attempt to summarize some of the ideas. And again, as I mentioned, we'll be sharing more through webinars as well as some other events. Okay, let's see. Okay, here is a question from Patrick Kwan, not sure of the organization, but a college degree is the price of admission that many families in poverty cannot pay. Would the Create Access to Good Jobs proposal include ideas for promoting that not every professional job requires a college degree and candidates should be considered if they don't have a degree? Really interesting question. I would encourage you to take a look at both our Future of Work paper and our Community College paper. Some of the discussions that we had within the partnership were about, as we think about sort of skills and education beyond high school, that doesn't necessarily always have to mean an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree, right? They're all different types of credentials, apprenticeship programs, and other formats where people can build their skills to get access to jobs. And then taking a look at the Future of Work paper, that is looking beyond just skills training and education and looking at, the different components that can make what are sometimes thought of as not so great jobs or bad jobs better jobs. And part of that is increasing access to benefits, accessing ability to be on a career pathway within a job or within an industry, whether that means through additional skills training or whether that means through experience that's gained on the job. Okay, I'm going to go to another question here from Sherelle Brown from the National Fair Housing Alliance, who asks, during the site visits around the country, did you have conversations about or consider improvements to current housing zip code to enable mobility? More often than not, upward mobility is about people moving from where they live to places of opportunity. Okay, the second part of my question can be expanded to include the impact of gentrification on individuals, families living in communities and neighborhoods that are segregated and experiencing poverty. Yeah, so absolutely great. As I said before, but let me just emphasize again that the partnership on our work absolutely took sort of a both and approach. So while we, will have this proposal coming out that's looking at housing vouchers and particularly better connecting those vouchers and the families that receive the vouchers to information about where they can move to opportunity neighborhoods and how they can connect to other services, particularly early childhood services, because we're focusing our proposal on families with children under 6, because we know, the analysis from Chetty and others about how the age of the child when a move happens makes a big difference. So children who move to opportunity neighborhoods when they're younger tend to benefit more. But that is only one piece of the strategy, one piece of the puzzle. Absolutely equally important is revitalizing neighborhoods. It's a wrong assumption to assume that every family can move or would want to move. And so we absolutely need to invest in revitalizing neighborhoods. And related to the second part of your question, we've tried to be really thoughtful in saying, as neighborhoods improve, as better housing stock, better jobs, hopefully better schools are available, that it's done in a very thoughtful way that preserves affordable housing and doesn't displace the original residents of that neighborhood. And so look for our Opportunity Neighborhoods paper coming out in the next couple of weeks for more detail on that. Okay. Let's see, here's, a long question I'm going to read to you. There are a lot of programs that offer services like housing vouchers to low-income families, which is great. However, what about those families that make $1 more than the income limits that restrict participation in these programs? I think the way we define poverty, especially when defined through income, can be flawed and isolate families that need assistance just as much as those who are within income limits. So what can we do, or what is being done to help those families that find themselves out of this needy criteria? That's a question from Raven Bland. It's a great question, and it's come up a lot in our discussions, and I think comes up a lot in all discussions about poverty in the U.S. And I think some of the more interesting thinking around this is to consider whether there are programs that can be offered on in a way that sort of the eligibility requirements ratchet up and down, right? Or are there services that can be offered on a sliding scale based on a family's income? And I think one of the policy innovations we've seen around this in recent years is looking at the reauthorization of the Child Care and Development Fund, right? So under that federal program, which provides resources to states and to tribes, that there's the ability for families to have 12-month eligibility that's guaranteed, right? So even if their income increases slightly, at least for a 12-month period, they're guaranteed eligibility for those child care vouchers. And I think there are probably other programs that could look at that policy and see if it's possible to learn from that and think about integrating those kinds of policies into other, both publicly and privately funded programs. Here's a question from Deborah Pontiso. I recognize that name. What is the lifespan of the U.S. partnership? So the U.S. partnership was always intended as a 2-year project. So as I mentioned before, the partnership itself, this group of amazing 24 people, our work will wrap up in May at the event that I mentioned. That'll be our final event. But our hope is that while the partnership formally will sort of cease to exist, that many of the collaborations and relationships that have formed throughout the partnership will continue, and that part of the legacy of our work, and really the ultimate test of the success of our work, is if the ideas get taken up, if they garner investment, and we begin to implement and test out some of these new ideas. Okay, here's a question from Nick Maynard with Commonwealth. How is this possible in the current political level, or maybe political environment is, I think, what maybe is the question here. This being state and federal programs and policies. Great question. And of course, the partnership began our work in early 2016. And as we're all well aware, the political context nationally and in many states and local communities has shifted dramatically. And depending on where you are in the country, there may be more or less appetite or interest in some of these ideas. But one thing that's really important to note, and I probably should have said it earlier in my remarks, the partnership was always intended to be long-term when it was launched, thinking sort of 10 years or more out. We know that these problems and these disparities took a long time to develop, and they're going to take a long time to solve. And so it's going to take sustained long-term investment. And we don't, we are not so naive as to think that these ideas will get necessarily taken up immediately, but they were never necessarily intended for any particular political administration. They really are long-term. And even for, there's some of the ideas that we're putting forward that, do require federal action, do require action by Congress. And that doesn't mean necessarily, it might feel like it today that all hope is lost. We think it's really important that momentum be built at the state and local level. And in fact, that's often always where the momentum is. But I think now more than ever is the time for some of the ideas we're putting forward to be invested in and tested at the state and local level to get proof of concept. Because, I've been in DC for almost 20 years. The pendulum swings back and forth. It will swing back again. And when there is a policy window or a policy opportunity, I think we as a field want to be ready with good, tested, evidence-based ideas. And I think a lot of that can come from private investment, but also public investment at the state and local level. So a really good question. Okay, here is a question from Estella at CSA San Diego County. How can we assist with the cross-sector collaboration strategy? Great question. We think there is an important role for every single person on this call. So whether you are working in philanthropy at a community foundation, whether you're working on housing at the local level, whether you're someone who's working in a federal agency, there's a role for everyone. And I think what that could look like is maybe different in each community, but part of it, I think, is sort of we hope that the strategy that we've put forward. I'm just going to flash back to this graphic with the 5 the 5 strategies. Is there, no one organization we think can or should take on all of these pieces. But for example, if you're an organization whose expertise is in job training, maybe there's a leadership role that your organization can play around creating access to good jobs, but how might you link arms with the local housing authority or an organization in your community that's working on safety and justice issues, and think about how your work intersects and how you might work together. So that's just one small example, but I would say think about where you can play a leadership role, and particularly how you might convene others in your community to come together. Okay, here's a question. From Myrna Leal. I work for the city of Brownsville, Texas, which has been listed multiple times as the poorest community in the country. How can we become more involved and commit to implement your ideas? Great question. I think my answer would be similar to the one that I shared before. Think about, within your role in the city of Brownsville, is there within the city government there a leadership role, a convening role that could be played to perhaps bring people together, not just across different city agencies, but thinking about some of the nonprofits, some of the philanthropic institutions in your community? And one of the things, I mentioned this event that we'll be hosting in DC on May 3rd. We're thinking about what it means for different organizations to make commitments to these strategies. And so if you've heard something on this call that inspires you and you think that your community or your organization might be prepared to make a commitment or to help lead an effort, we'd love to hear from you directly and would be interested in talking with you offline. So I hope you'll feel free to follow up. You can email me. I'm just nisha@urban.org, or you can email the events email on that you saw on your screen, and we'd be happy to follow up. Okay, I think we've got about 5 more minutes, so we'll take a few more questions. Let's see. Here's a question from another name I recognize, Marcela Montes from the Aspen Institute. It's wonderful to see that changing the narrative is an overarching element of the framework. How different segments of society see people in poverty and talk about people in poverty very much affect our policies and practices. However, much of this work will also require efforts to shift culture and values. How is the group thinking about that? You're absolutely right, Marcela. And I think we've had some of the most interesting conversations about narrative. And one of the things I think, particularly for our group that makes them interesting, it's a pretty different animal than some of the other strategies. I imagine many of you, if you look at, jobs, place-based, place-conscious strategies, providing support to individuals and families in a family-centered way, those are probably concepts many of you are familiar with and actually probably are a part of moving them forward. Narrative change is a little bit different than some of the work that many of us engaged in program design and policy have been involved with. And it absolutely is, as Marcela says, about shifting culture and values. It's about shifting mindsets often. And the strategies tend to look pretty different. And the partners that we need to bring to the table look pretty different. And so thinking even beyond nonprofits, government, and philanthropies, the sense of our group that's been working on these strategies is that we actually need to bring to the table people who have experience and expertise in pop culture, in media, in film, in television. And we've done a little bit of piloting of, doing some matching of bringing together people who work in those creative industries with people who have expertise in poverty. And we think much more of that needs to be done. And again, we think it's absolutely a long-term effort. Culture shift, value shift, mindset shifts definitely don't happen overnight. Okay, another question. I think we have time probably for 1 or 2 more. This is from Ed Hidalgo with the Cajon Valley Union School District. Have you considered the value of early childhood career development in public schools? This is missing across elementary, middle, and high school. How can a child aspire to a career they don't know exists? Career and technical education is not sufficient. Oh, interesting. We've certainly talked about early childhood development as an absolutely pivotal and key time within the life course that we need to focus on. And so a few of our strategies, particularly scaling up home visiting programs, expanding the child tax credit, and expanding housing vouchers for families with young children, are targeted toward that stage in development. One of the things that we've talked about, particularly with our proposal around scaling up home visiting, is that as much as we'd like to see that happen quickly, one of the reasons it can't is because we need to build the infrastructure and we need to train the workforce. And I think your question relates exactly to that. In order to have a trained workforce, we first need to get young people interested in those careers. And I think that's true of a lot of different industries, but it's one of the things that's really interesting about early childhood is it fits into that sector that I talked about that's so important, the care sector. These are jobs that right now at least require empathy, so they're not going to be replaced by robots. They can't be outsourced overseas. We actually need people here who can provide those very important services. And one of the things I think that might make a big difference in attracting more young people to those careers is if we can do more to increase the quality of those jobs, right? Increase the career pathways of those jobs. And I think you're probably absolutely right. It needs to start well beyond before young people graduate from high school. Okay, I think we have time for probably one more question. I see another name I recognize. Paula Sammons from the Kellogg Foundation asks, what is your hope or insights around how philanthropy can come together to fund these multi-issue, multi-sector, public-private collaborations differently when often philanthropy is organized by their siloed programs? You are so right, Paula. It's a great question. And I think, my message to philanthropy would be the same one that I, just gave to the person in Brownsville and other folks that were asking how they can get engaged. So, a particular foundation, the Kellogg Foundation, I know has particular expertise in focusing on children and families. So how might the Kellogg Foundation play a leadership role and convene other funders? But think about reaching across some of these silos and maybe partnering with other funders that would want to focus on narrative change work, or other funders that are really deep in the space of data systems. How might you all work together and think about, coming together? Even some might even call it, which is sort of maybe a funny word to use for philanthropy, but a movement where people recognize the different leadership roles they can play and can work in a more coordinated way. And I'd be happy to talk with you, Paula, and others offline more about how we make that happen. So I'm getting the sign that we are at time, and I know you're all really busy people. So I want to thank you all for joining us today. Thank you for all the terrific questions. And if you didn't get a chance to ask your question, again, I invite you to follow up by email or by Twitter. We're very interested in hearing your reactions. For further information, you can go to our website, mobilitypartnership.org. There's my email, there's my Twitter handle, and I guess I wasn't supposed to click that. Okay, that is the end of the webinar, and I am supposed to remind you that the recording will be available online on our website, mobilitypartnership.org, and we look forward to connecting with you in the coming weeks through the forthcoming webinars, and we look forward to your reactions to all of our forthcoming idea papers. Thanks, everyone.